It was the kind of cold that cracked engine blocks and froze the pity right out of you. Cherie should have stepped over the bleeding man blocking her apartment door. In this city, minding your own business wasn't just good manners. It was survival. But she didn't. She dragged a shivering, dying stranger into her kitchen. Big mistake. Because when the sun finally came up, the shivering victim was gone, and the city's most ruthless syndicate boss had a new obsession. The Elra smelled like wet wool and stale regret. Cherie leaned her forehead against the scratched acrylic window, watching the blur of sodium vapor lights bleed through the sleet. It was 3:14 a.m. Her feet arced with a dull, rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with the train's wheels clacking over the rusted tracks. Working a double shift at St. Jude's emergency room on a Friday night meant she had spent the last 16 hours dealing with stab wounds, overdoses, and the aggressive entitlement of drunks. She just wanted a hot shower. Even a lukewarm one would do. Assuming the boiler in her building hadn't surrendered to the December freeze again, Cherie pulled her collar up as she exited the station. The wind off the river hit her like a physical blow, driving icy needles into her cheeks. The streets of the South Side were completely dead. Sensible people were indoors. The only things moving were stray rappers tumbling over the concrete, and Cherie herself, head down, keys clutched between her knuckles in a makeshift weapon. She turned into the narrow alley that led to the rear entrance of her building. The front door's lock had been jammed for a week, and the landlord was entirely unbothered by it. That was when she saw the boot. It was expensive leather scuffed at the toe, sticking out from behind the overflowing dumpster. Cherie stopped. Every survival instinct she had, honed over 6 years of living in this neighborhood, screamed at her to turn around, walk to the 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, and wait for daylight. You didn't investigate bodies in alleys. You didn't play Good Samaritan. You kept your eyes forward and your mouth shut. But the boot twitched. A low, rattling exhale sounded over the whistling wind. Cherie cursed under her breath. She unclenched her keys, tightened her grip on her canvas tote bag, and took a cautious step forward. "Hey," she called out, her voice barely carrying over the storm. "I'm not looking for trouble. You alive down there?" No answer, just another ragged, wet breath. She rounded the edge of the dumpster. A man was slumped against the brick wall, half submerged in a puddle of freezing slush. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat that looked heavy enough to drown in. His chin rested on his chest, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the sleet. Cherie crouched, keeping a safe distance. "Mister." He didn't move, but the ambient light from the street lamp caught something dark and slick pooling beneath his left side. It wasn't just water. The metallic scent of blood cut through the smell of garbage and ozone. She told herself to leave, to walk inside, lock her deadbolts, and anonymously call a dispatch that would take 45 minutes to arrive. By then the cold would have finished whatever the bullet or the knife had started. He would just be another statistic in a city built on them. But she was a nurse. Worse, she was a nurse who remembered what it felt like to get a phone call at 3:00 in the morning telling her someone she loved had bled out on wet asphalt because nobody bothered to stop. "Damn it," she muttered. Cherie dropped to her knees, careless of the freezing slush soaking through her jeans. She reached out, pressing 2 fingers hard against the side of his neck. His skin was like ice. The pulse beneath it was there, but it was thready, faint, racing. Shock was setting in, compounded by severe hypothermia. His head lulled to the side, and for a second she saw his face, sharp jawline, a jagged, bleeding cut above his eyebrow. He was young, maybe early 30s, but his features were set in a grim, hard line, even in unconsciousness. "Okay, you stubborn idiot. You're not dying on my stoop," Sherry said. She grabbed him by the lapels of his coat and pulled. He was incredibly heavy, dead weight made worse by the waterlogged wool. Sherry groaned, her boots slipping on the ice. She managed to haul him upright, sliding her shoulder under his armpit. The man groaned, a raw, guttural sound. His eyes fluttered open. Just a sliver. They were dark, unfocused, staring blankly at the brick wall. "Walk," she ordered, her voice harsh. "I can't carry you. You have to use your legs." He didn't understand her, but a primal reflex seemed to kick in. His boots scraped against the pavement. Together, they stumbled the remaining heft to the heavy metal door of her building. Cherie fumbled with her keys with one hand, bracing his shifting weight with her hip. The door clicked open. She shoved it with her shoulder and dragged him into the dim, fluorescent-lit hallway. It smelled like boiled cabbage and cheap weed, but it was out of the wind. He collapsed immediately, taking Cherie down with him. She scraped her knees on the linoleum, but scrambled back up. No, not here. Up the stairs. Come on." It took 10 agonizing minutes to get him up 2 flights of stairs. By the time she unlocked the door to apartment 2B, Cherie was drenched in sweat, her lungs burning. She dragged him across the threshold, kicked the door shut with her heel, and threw the deadbolt. She let him drop onto the faded linoleum of her tiny kitchen. The man lay there, utterly still, a dark puddle of water and blood beginning to spread across the cheap flooring. Cherie locked the chain, leaned against the door, and stared at him. The silence of the apartment settled around them, broken only by the angry hiss of the radiator in the corner. She had just brought a bleeding, mysterious man into her home. "Well," she breathed to the empty room. This is how horror movies start. Cherie didn't have time to panic. Panic was a luxury for people whose patients weren't bleeding out on their kitchen floor. She stripped off her wet coat, kicked off her boots, and dropped to the floor beside him. The first priority was getting the wet clothes off. Hypothermia would kill him before the blood loss did. She rolled him onto his back. He groaned, a deep, raspy sound, and his right hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with terrifying bruising force. Cherie froze. His eyes were open now, dark, flat, like staring into an empty elevator shaft. Despite the fact that his lips were blue and he was actively dying, his grip was like an industrial vice. "Hospital," he slurred, his voice rough as sandpaper. "No hospital." "You need a doctor," Cherie said evenly, refusing to show the spike of fear hitting her chest. "You're bleeding." "No cops, no hospital." His grip tightened, grinding her bones together. "Understand." There was no desperation in his voice, just a cold, absolute command. It wasn't a plea. It was a threat. "Fine," Cherie said, maintaining eye contact. "No cops, no hospital. Now let go of me before I let you bleed to death on my security deposit." He studied her face for a long, agonizing second, his eyes tracking every micro-expression. Then his hand went slack, dropping to the floor as his eyes rolled back in his head. Cherie rubbed her wrist, suppressing a shudder. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from her work tote. She started with the coat, cutting it up the sleeves to avoid moving him more than necessary. Once the heavy wool was peeled away, she cut through a ruined, blood-soaked dress shirt. The damage was ugly, but not immediately fatal. A deep laceration ran along his left rib cage, It wasn't a bullet hole. It looked like a slash from a serrated blade, long and jagged. It had missed the major organs, but it was deep enough to require stitches, and the bleeding was steady. His torso was covered in bruises, some fading yellow, others a fresh, angry purple. He looked like a man who made his living getting hit by trucks. Cherie pushed herself up and ran to her tiny bathroom. She grabbed a clean towel, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, a needle, and a spool of heavy silk thread she kept in her personal first aid kit. She wasn't a surgeon, but she had closed enough bar fight wounds and triage to know the mechanics. Returning to the kitchen, she knelt beside him. "This is going to suck," she warned the unconscious man. She pressed the towel hard against the wound. His body seized, a violent jolt of pain that arched his spine off the floor, but he didn't wake. Cherie kept the pressure steady for 5 minutes, watching the war clock tick until the bleeding slowed to an ooze. She cleaned the edges of the cut with alcohol. His muscles twitched in response to the sting. Threading the needle, she took a deep breath. She had no anesthetics, just a needle, thread, and grim determination. She pinched the skin together and drove the needle through. He woke up on the 3rd stitch. His eyes snapped open, and a sharp intake of breath hissed through his teeth. His hand flew up, clamping around her throat. Cherie stopped. The needle held midair. She didn't drop it. She didn't fight his hand. She just looked down at him. His fingers were loose enough that she could breathe, but the threat was explicit. "You're awake," she said, her voice remarkably steady. He stared at her, his chest heaving, taking in the sterile needle, the bloody towel, and the dingy yellow cabinets of her kitchen. He looked down at his own ribs. "What are you doing?" he rasped, trying to keep your insides from becoming outsides. Cherie replied, "You're cut badly. I'm stitching it. If you strangle me, I can't finish the job, and you'll ruin my floor." He studied her again. That same calculating, flat stare. His thumb brushed lightly against her pulse point. He was feeling her heart rate, looking for panic, looking for a lie. Slowly his hand retreated from her throat. He let his head fall back against the linoleum. "Do you have whiskey?" "I have half a bottle of cheap vodka in the freezer," she said. "Get it." Cherie tied off the stitch, stood up, and retrieved the frosted bottle. She didn't bother with the glass, just handed it to him. He unscrewed the cap with one hand and took a long, punishing pull. He didn't even dumboose as the cheap liquor hit the back of his throat. "Keep going," he ordered, handing the bottle back. Cherie knelt down again. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds in the apartment were the hiss of the radiator, the wind outside, and the quiet sound of silk thread pulling through skin. He didn't make another sound. He didn't groan, didn't flinch. He just watched the ceiling, his jaw locked tight. When she was finally done, he tied off the last knot and wiped away the excess iodine. She taped a square of sterile gauze over the messy row of black stitches. "Done," she said, rocking back on her heels. He didn't say thank you. He just shifted, propping himself up on one elbow with a grunt of effort. He looked around the tiny apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, the single armchair by the window. "You live here alone?" he asked. "None of your business." He looked back at her. For the first time, Cherie really looked at him. Without the blood and the freezing slush, he was striking. High cheekbones, a sharp patrician nose, and eyes that were so dark brown they bordered on black. But there was no warmth in his face. He looked entirely hollowed out. A machine, operating on low battery. "You shouldn't have brought me in," he said softly. "Next time I find a man dying in my garbage, I'll be sure to leave him there." Sherry shot back, exhausted and irritable. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. You were freezing to death. People die every day. You intervene, you make yourself a target. I'm a nurse. It's an occupational hazard. Cherie stood up, gathering the bloody towels and ruined clothing. She tossed them into a plastic garbage bag. "You can take the couch. I'm going to sleep. If you steal my television, I'll hunt you down and rip those stitches out with my teeth." He actually let out a dry, rattling chuckle at that. "Your television is a heavy, outdated piece of junk. It's safe." Cherie grabbed a worn fleece blanket from the armchair and tossed it at him. "Sleep or don't, but stay quiet." She walked into her bedroom and locked the door. She knew it was a flimsy lock. If the man wanted to get in, he easily could. But she was too tired to care. She fell onto her mattress in her clothes, fully expecting to spend the night staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps. Instead, she was asleep before her head hit the pillow. Cherie woke to the harsh glare of winter sunlight stabbing through the gap in her blinds. She blinked, disoriented, her mouth tasting like copper and old coffee. For a split second, she thought the events of the previous night were a stress-induced fever dream. Then she felt the ache in her knees and remembered the blood on the kitchen floor. She sat up instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She listened. Silence. The radiator wasn't hissing anymore. There was no sound of breathing, no shifting weight from the living room. Cherie hid off the bed, grabbed a heavy wooden clothes hanger from her closet as a pathetic makeshift club, and quietly unlocked her bedroom door. She pushed it open. The apartment was empty. The fleece blanket was folded in a neat, perfect square on the arm of the couch. The plastic garbage bag containing his ruined, blood-soaked clothes was gone. The kitchen floor had been wiped completely clean. The only evidence that a man had nearly died in her apartment was the faint, lingering smell of iodine and damp wool. Cherie lowered the clothes hanger, feeling a bizarre mixture of immense relief and strange disappointment. She walked into the kitchen to start the coffee maker. As she reached for her favorite mug, she stopped. Sitting on the Formica countertop, right next to the stack of overdue electric bills, was a thick stack of $100 bills. It was banded with a plain white paper strip. Cherie stared at it. She didn't touch it. She knew what a stack like that looked like from movies. It was $10,000 easily, maybe more. Underneath the stack of money was a small cream-cold card. It was a business card, entirely blank, except for a single phone number embossed in black ink on the front. Cherie backed away from the counter. Her breathing went shallow. Men who left $10,000 on a kitchen counter in the South Side weren't normal men. They weren't tourists who got mugged. She walked quickly to the window overlooking the street. The storm had broken, leaving the city buried under a thick layer of pristine, blinding white snow. The street was quiet, unplowed, but parked directly across from her building, idling in the freezing morning air, was a black, heavily tinted SUV. As Cherie watched, the driver's side window rolled down an inch. A plume of cigarette smoke drifted out into the cold air. Whoever was inside was just sitting there, watching her building. Cherie yanked the blinds shut. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing. She went to the kitchen counter, picked up her phone with trembling fingers, and opened a local news app. The headline was written in bold, urgent text. Syndicate wars escalate. Massacre at the docks. Rumors circulate regarding fate of new boss. Sherry clicked the article. Her eyes scanned the text rapidly. A power grab. A betrayal within the city's largest organized crime family. A shootout that left 6 men dead. The newly appointed head of the family had been ambushed. Authorities were uncertain if he had survived the night. She scrolled down. There was a file photo attached to the article. Sherry stopped breathing. It was him, the man from the alley. His hair was slicked back in the photo. He was wearing a bespoke suit, and there was no blood on his face. But the cold, dead eyes were exactly the same. The caption read, Lau Calvino, presumed head of the Calino Syndicate. Sherry looked slowly from the phone screen to the stack of money on her counter. She hadn't just saved a random victim of the city's violence. She had saved the architect of it. She had stitched up a monster, handed him a bottle of vodka, and told him not to steal her television. A sharp knock at her apartment door made her jump, a muffled shriek escaping her lips. She stared at the door. The deadbolt was locked. The chain was on. "Miss Murphy," a voice called out from the hallway. It wasn't the growly voice of the man from last night. It was brisk, professional, and loud enough to carry through the wood. "Detective James Brody, Chicago PD. Open up, please." Sherry looked at the money. She looked at the blank card. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to go to work, pay her bills, and survive. Instead, the city's apex predator had slept on her couch, and now the cops were at her door. The shivering stranger was gone, but the nightmare was just beginning. Cher's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm. She stared at the cheap veneer of her front door, listening to the heavy knuckles rap against the wood for a second time. "Miss Murphy, I know you're in there. Building manager said you got off shift a few hours ago." She moved. Survival overrode paralysis. Cherie grabbed the thick stack of $100 bills and the blank business card off the counter. She shoved them deep into the bottom of her flour canister, burying the paper under a mound of deep, bleached white powder. She snapped the lid shut, wiped her palms on her jeans, and took a slow, stabilizing breath. She walked to the door and undid the chain, but left the deadbolt thrown, opening the door just 2 in. Detective James Brody looked exactly how the South Side felt in February. Exhausted, grey, and entirely out of patience. He wore a rumpled tan overcoat over a suit that had given up holding a crease sometime during the previous decade. His badge hung on a chain around his neck, resting against a crooked striped tie. "Sherry Murphy?" he asked. His voice was a low gravel rumble. "Yes," Cherie said, keeping her tone flat, defensive. The standard posture of anyone talking to a cop in this zip code. "Can I help you, detective? Mind if I step in?" Brody didn't wait for an answer, shifting his weight forward. Cherie held the door firm. "Actually, I do mind. I worked a 16-hour trauma shift, detective. I've been asleep for exactly 3 hours. Whatever this is, it can happen in the hallway." Brody stopped. He didn't look angry, just mildly inconvenienced. He pulled a small, spiral-bound notepad from his coat pocket. "Fair enough. We got an anonymous call about an hour ago. Someone spotted a significant amount of blood in the alley behind this building. A trail of it leads right up to the back service door." Cherie kept her face entirely blank. She dug her fingernails into the meat of her palm. "I came through the front door." "Front door lock is busted," Brody noted. "Has been for a week," Cherie shot back. "The landlord is useless. That's why I lock my own door. Brodie's eyes, a washed-out, watery blue, slowly scanned the 2 inches of Cher's apartment he could see through the gap. He took a slow breath through his nose. Smells like iodine in there. I'm a nurse, Cherie said, without missing a beat. I carried home a pair of scrubs that got soaked in betadine during a chest tube insertion. They were sitting in my laundry basket. Brodie chewed on the inside of his cheek. He looked at her hands. She had scrubbed the blood from under her fingernails, but her knuckles were raw from the harsh soap. You see anything when you came home last night? Brodie asked. Anyone hanging around? Anyone bleeding? At 3:00 in the morning, Cherie let a bitter edge creep into her voice. If I saw someone bleeding in that alley, I would have kept walking. I fix people when they're on my table at St. Jude's. I don't go looking for them in the dark. It was the perfect lie, because it was exactly what a tired, hardened city resident would do. Brodie nodded slowly, accepting the cynical logic. Right, Brodie said. He flipped his notebook shut and shoved it back into his pocket. Well, keep your chain on, Miss Murphy. Word on the wire is there was a major shake-up across town last night. A lot of lead flying. The new head of the Colino family took a hit. Nobody knows if he's dead or just hiding. If he's hiding, he's going to be looking for a hole to crawl into. Cherie forced herself to hold his gaze. I'll keep that in mind. If you see anything or smell anything besides your laundry, call it in, Brodie said. He turned and walked down the dim cabbage-scented hallway, his heavy shoes scuffing against the linoleum. Cherie shut the door, threw the deadbolt. She slid down the wood until she hit the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked toward the flour canister. $10,000. A blank card. Leo Calvino wasn't hiding in a hole. He was operating. He had left her a tip. Walked out of her apartment with fresh stitches. And now he had a black SUV parked across the street, watching her window. She wasn't a good Samaritan anymore. She was an accessory, and the police were already circling. Cherie closed her eyes, the exhaustion finally crashing over her like a physical weight. She had another shift in 4 hours. The city didn't care if you were caught in a mob war. The rent was still due. The emergency room at St. Jude's was a chaotic, fluorescent-lit trench. It was a Saturday night, which meant the triage board was a solid block of red and yellow priority codes. Cherie moved through the chaos with mechanical precision. She started an IV on a dehydrated teenager, applied a pressure dressing to a domestic dispute victim, and pushed 2 milligrams of Ativan to a man convinced he was covered in invisible spiders. The blood, the screaming, the smell of bleach and sweat. It usually grounded her. It was a violent world, but it was a world with rules, protocols, dosages, vital signs. Tonight she couldn't focus. Every time the automatic sliding doors to the ambulance bay hissed open, Cher's chest tightened. She expected to see a black SUV pull up. She expected to see men in heavy wool coats carrying a bleeding Leo Calvino back to her. Or worse, she expected Detective Brodie to walk through the waiting room, holding up a plastic bag with her bloody trauma shears inside. Murphy, you're drifting, Charge Nurse Miller snapped, snapping her fingers in front of Cherie's face. 4 needs a stat run to CT. Head trauma. Let's go. Right. Sorry. Cherie grabbed the chart and pushed the gurney down the hall, forcing her mind back into the sterile reality of the hospital. By the time her shift ended 200 a.m., Cherie felt like a hollowed-out shell. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, throwing her heavy canvas coat over her shoulders. She just wanted to go home, pull the covers over her head, and pretend the last 24 hours hadn't happened. She walked out the employee exit into the biting winter air. The parking lot was a sprawling expanse of cracked asphalt, poorly lit by flickering sodium bulbs. Cherie didn't own a car. She took the bus, which meant a 4B block walk to the nearest covered shelter. She pulled her beanie down over her ears and started walking, her boots crunching on the frozen slush left over from yesterday's storm. Halfway down the block, a shadow detached itself from the side of a closed pawn shop. Cherie froze, her hand instinctively diving into her coat pocket, wrapping around the small canister of pepper spray she always carried. The man stepped under the streetlight. He wasn't Leo Calvino. He was younger, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Cherie made in a year, paired inexplicably with heavy steel-toed work boots. He had a broken nose that hadn't healed straight and calm, intelligent eyes. He held up a paper cup. Steam rose from the plastic lid. "Black coffee?" the man said. His voice was smooth, carrying easily over the wind. No sugar, extra shot of espresso. Cherie didn't let go of the pepper spray. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Finn," he said, taking a slow step forward and placing the coffee cup on the metal newspaper distribution box between them. He stepped back, keeping his hands visible. "Mr. Calvino asked me to ensure you made it to the bus stop without incident. The ice is treacherous tonight." Cherie stared at the cup. "I don't want his coffee, and I don't need a babysitter. Tell your boss I want to be left alone." Finn offered a small, polite smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. No has a great deal of respect for your privacy, Miss Murphy, but he also has a debt. In his world, debts are anchors. They keep you steady. He likes to keep his anchors secure." "I didn't ask for a debt," Cherie snapped, the fear turning into hot, sharp anger. "I saved his life because he was bleeding on my garbage. If he wants to repay me, he can call off the SUV parked outside my apartment and pretend he never met me." Finn shook his head slowly. "The men in the SUV aren't watching you, Miss Murphy. They're watching the street. There was a power struggle last night. Certain parties are looking for leverage against Mr. Calvino. You pulled him out of the cold. That makes you leverage." The cold air seemed to hit Cherie all at once, piercing straight to her bones. "Brody," she whispered. "The detective?" Finn nodded. "He's sniffing around. He belongs to the precinct, but his lieutenant belongs to the Lucchesi family, the people who tried to kill Leo last night. If Brody connects you to Leo, he won't arrest you. He'll hand you over to them." Cherie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She gripped the edge of her coat tightly. "So, what am I supposed to do?" "You go to work. You pay your rent. You live your life," Finn said calmly. "And you keep the card he left you. If Brody pushes, or if anyone you don't recognize knocks on your door, you call the number. And if I don't, then you're playing the odds in a very dangerous game," Finn said. He pulled his collar up. "Take the coffee, Cherie. It's cold out here." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alleyway as quickly as he had appeared. Cherie stood alone under the flickering streetlight for a long time. Eventually, she reached out and picked up the paper cup. It was scalding hot. She wrapped her freezing fingers around it, taking a small sip. It was exactly how she liked it. The realization that they knew her coffee order was far more terrifying than the men in the SUV. When she finally made it back to her apartment building, Cherie paused on the stoop. The heavy front door, the one with the rusted, jammed lock that had been broken for a week, was closed tight. Cherie reached out and pushed the handle. It didn't budge. She looked closely at the wood. A brand new, heavy-duty commercial deadbolt had been installed into the doorframe. The brass was completely untarnished, gleaming faintly in the dim hall light. Taped to the glass pane of the door was a small manila envelope with her apartment number, 2B, written on it in sharp, elegant black ink. Cherie pulled the envelope down and ripped it open. Inside was a single, freshly cut brass key. She stared at the shiny metal in her palm. Her landlord hadn't fixed the door at 3:00 in the morning on a Sunday. Lau Calvino had fixed it. He was locking the rest of the world out, or he was locking her in. Cherie slipped the key into the new deadbolt. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. She walked inside, listening to the solid thud of the door closing behind her. Sealing her inside the fortress, a Mafia boss was building around her. For 3 days, Cherie lived in a state of suspended animation. She went to work, she rode the bus. She unlocked the gleaming new deadbolt on her apartment door and stared at the flour canister on her counter. She didn't touch the money. Touching it made it real. Touching it meant accepting that the blood she had scrubbed off her linoleum belonged to a man who commanded shadows and bought silence in stacks of $100 bills. She tried to convince herself Finn was wrong. The men in the SUV were gone. The street outside her window was just an empty, snow-packed road again. Maybe Leo Calvino had recovered enough to crawl back to whatever dark penthouse he ruled from. And this was over. Then came Thursday night. St. Jude's was unusually quiet, the lull before the inevitable midnight rush of alcohol poisoning and bar fights. Cherie was in the back hallway doing inventory in supply room B. It was a windowless concrete box filled with wire racks of saline bags, sterile gauze, and incubation kits. It smelled fiercely of bleach and cardboard. She was counting boxes of nitrile gloves when she heard the heavy squeak of rubber soles on the linoleum behind her. Cherie turned, expecting to see Nurse Miller holding a clipboard. Instead, a man stood blocking the narrow doorway. He wasn't wearing scrubs. He wore a cheap, oversized leather jacket that squeaked when he shifted his weight, and a thick gold chain rested against the collar of his black shirt. He was chewing gum with an open, slack jaw. "You Cherie?" he asked. His voice was a nasal whine, but there was nothing weak about the way he occupied the space. He stepped into the supply closet and let the heavy fire door swing shut behind him. It latched with a definitive metallic click. Cherie's stomach plummeted. Her pulse spiked, hammering a frantic rhythm in her throat. She stepped back, bumping into the wire rack. The saline bags shifted with a dull slosh. "Pence aren't allowed back here," Cherie said. Her voice wavered, betraying the false bravado she tried to project. "The waiting room is down the hall." The man smiled. It was an ugly expression, revealing a chipped front tooth. "I ain't a patient, sweetheart. Name's Vic. A mutual friend pointed me your way, Detective Brody. He said you had a busy weekend. Said, you came home real late Friday night, right around the time a certain individual went missing in your neighborhood." Cherie gripped the edge of the wire shelf. The metal dug into her palms. Brody. Finn had been right. The detective hadn't just been fishing. He had been painting a target on her back. "I don't know what you're talking about," Cherie said, keeping her eyes locked on his. "I came home, went to sleep, and came back to work. If you don't leave this room right now, I'm pressing the panic button on my pager." She didn't have a panic button. St. Jude's was chronically underfunded, but Vic didn't know that. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap, stinging cologne rolled off him. "Here's the thing, Cherie," Vic said. his tone dropping the faux friendly act. My employers are missing a guy who took a very bad slice to the ribs. He was bleeding like a stuck pig in the alley behind your building. Then poof, he vanishes. And you, a nurse who knows how to sew up a hole, happen to live right there. Now, maybe you're just a good citizen who patched up a stray dog. Or maybe you know where that dog went to lick his wounds. He reached out, his thick, calloused hand wrapping around her upper arm. His grip was sudden and vicious, his fingers digging painfully into her bicep. Cherie gasped, trying to jerk away, but he slammed her back against the metal rack. A box of syringes tumbled to the floor, scattering plastic across the concrete. "I don't know anything," Cherie choked out, the panic finally overriding her control. "Listen to me, you stupid," Vic hissed, leaning in so close she could feel his hot, sour breath on her face. "Leo Calvino is a dead man walking. The Liazzi family is taking the city. If you're hiding him, or if you know who came to get him, you tell me right now, because if I have to come to your shitty little apartment to ask you again, I won't be asking nicely." He squeezed her arm harder. Cherie felt a sickening pop of pressure in her shoulder joint. Tears of sheer pain pricked her eyes. Her right hand blindly felt along the shelf behind her. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, solid plastic object, the sharps container. Without thinking, Cherie grabbed the thick red plastic box and swung it as hard as she could. The hard edge caught Vic square in the temple. He grunted, stunned, his grip loosening just enough. Cherie shoved him backward. Vic stumbled, his heel catching on the scattered syringes, and he went down hard onto one knee. Cherie didn't wait. She bolted. She yanked the heavy fire door open and ran down the hallway, her boots pounding against the linoleum. She didn't look back. She pushed through the double doors of the employee locker room, nearly tearing the hinges off, and slammed the door shut behind her, throwing her weight against it. She stood there, chest heaving, listening for footsteps. Nothing. The hallway outside remained quiet. Cherie collapsed onto the wooden bench in front of her locker. Her left arm throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. She pulled up the sleeve of her scrub top. A dark, angry bruise in the shape of 4 thick fingers was already blooming on her pale skin. She was out of time. She was out of options. She couldn't just leverage any more. She was prey. With a shaking hand, Cherie reached into her bag. She pulled out her phone and slipped the back of the case off. The blank, cream-colored business card fell into her lap. She stared at the 10 digits embossed in black ink. She had spent the last 3 days hating this piece of paper. Now it was the only lifeline she had left. She unlocked her phone and dialed the number. The line rang exactly once. "Speak." The voice was a low, resonant baritone. It was gravel and iron, stripping away the sterile hospital noise around her. It was him. Cherie closed her eyes, a shuddering breath escaping her lips. "He found me." There was a fraction of a second of silence on the line. The temperature of the phone call seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Cherie, it wasn't a question." He remembered her voice. "A man named Vic," Cherie said, the words rushing out of her in a panicked, breathless stream. "He cornered me in a supply closet. He works for the Lucici family. He said Brody sent him. He knows about the alley. He knows what I do." "Are you hurt?" Leo's voice was completely devoid of panic. It was clinical, terrifyingly calm. "He grabbed me," she said, looking down at the purple finger marks on her arm. "I hit him. I locked myself in the employee locker room, but I can't stay here, and I can't go home. Listen to me very carefully, Lau instructed. The cadence of his voice was hypnotic, forcing her racing heart to match its steady rhythm. Do not go back to the emergency room. Do not speak to your charge nurse. Walk out the south exit by the loading docks. There is a blind spot in the security cameras by the commercial dumpsters. You have exactly 4 minutes. Go. The line went dead. Cherie dropped the phone into her bag. She didn't bother changing out of her scrubs or grabbing her heavy coat. She slung her canvas tote over her shoulder and pushed open the locker room door. The hospital corridors were a blur. She kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of an orderly pushing a laundry cart. She navigated the maze of back hallways, the smell of bleach giving way to the smell of exhaust and freezing rain as she pushed through the heavy metal doors of the south exit. The loading dock was dark, illuminated only by a single, flickering yellow bulb. The wind howled off the concrete, instantly biting through her thin cotton scrubs. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering as she stepped down the metal stairs and hurried toward the massive green commercial dumpsters. She stood in the shadows, hugging herself, her eyes darting across the empty, snow-dusted alley. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Nothing. Panic began to claw at her throat again. What if he wasn't coming? What if Vic had followed her? She backed further into the shadows, her hand gripping the pepper spray in her bag. Tires hissed against the wet pavement. A sleek black SUV, the same one that had parked outside her apartment, turned into the alley. Didn't have its headlights on. It rolled forward like a shark cutting through dark water and stopped abruptly inches from the dumpsters. The rear passenger door swung open. "Get in," a voice commanded from the dark interior. Cherie didn't hesitate. She practically threw herself into the vehicle. The door pulled shut behind her, with a heavy pressurized thud, sealing her inside. The contrast was jarring. The interior of the SUV was incredibly warm, smelling of rich leather and the faint, clean scent of bergamot. The windows were tinted so darkly that the outside world was reduced to a murky, shifting blur. Cherie sat on the edge of the seat, her chest heaving, her hands gripping her knees. "Drive," the voice said. The SUV smoothly accelerated, pulling out of the alley and merging into the sparse midnight traffic. Cherie finally turned her head. Leo Calvino sat in the seat next to her. He looked vastly different from the bleeding, half-dead corpse she had dragged into her kitchen. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit that hid the bandages she knew were wrapped around his ribs. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his jaw clean-shaven. The jagged cut above his eyebrow was covered by a neat, sterile steri-strip. He didn't look like a man who had nearly died 3 days ago. He looked like power, absolute, unapologetic power. But his eyes were exactly the same, dark, flat, and intensely calculating. He was looking at her, his gaze dropping briefly to her bare, shivering arms, and then resting on the dark, swelling bruise Vic had left on her bicep. A muscle in Leo's jaw feathered. It was the only crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade. "I told you," Cherie said, her voice shaking with a mixture of leftover adrenaline and sudden overwhelming anger. "I told Finn I didn't want to be involved. I told you to leave me alone." "You did," Leo agreed smoothly. He reached out and pressed a button on the door console. The heat in the back of the SUV dialed up, washing over Cher's freezing skin. But Brody forced the issue. He sold your name to the Lucazes to clear his own gambling debts. "So what happens now?" Cherie demanded, turning fully toward him. "Do I get an apology? Do I get a plane ticket out of the city?" "You left $10,000 in my flour canister, Leo," I don't want your money. I want my life back." Leo watched her outburst without flinching. He let her anger wash over him completely unfazed. "Your life, as you knew it, ended the moment you decided to play doctor in that alley, Cherie." He leaned forward slightly. The proximity made Cherie hyper-aware of the sheer size of him, the coiled tension radiating from his frame. "Vic, knowing your name means the entire Lucasi family knows your name. You can't go back to your apartment. You can't go back to St. Jude's. You have no right to dictate my life," she snapped. "I'm the only reason you still have one," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rumble. "Vic wasn't there to ask you questions. He was there to break your fingers until you gave up my location. And then he was going to put a bullet in your head and leave you in that closet." Cherie stared at him, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She knew he was telling the truth. She had seen the look in Vic's eyes. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly, her voice finally breaking. Leo reached across the wide leather seat. For a moment, Cherie thought he was going to touch her, but he simply picked up a heavy cashmere throw blanket, folded on the middle console, and dropped it over her shivering shoulders. "We are going home," Leo said, turning his gaze back to the tinted window, watching the neon lights of the city blur past. "And until I burn the Liazzi family to the ground, you belong to me." The private elevator rose in absolute silence. No grinding gears, no swaying cables, just a digital readout ticking off floors until it stopped at 42. The chrome doors slid apart, revealing a space that made Cherie's chest ache with its sheer cavernous emptiness. The penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and dark slate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the city lights glittering like crushed glass against the black expanse of Lake Michigan. It was breathtaking. It was also terrifying. You couldn't hide in a room made of glass. Leo stepped out of the elevator first, his movements stiff. The adrenaline of the extraction was wearing off. "Finn will bring your things tomorrow," Leo said, walking toward a massive matte black kitchen island. "Whatever you need from your apartment, clothes, documents." "I don't need anything from my apartment," Cherie said, stepping cautiously onto the polished hardwood. She pulled the cashmere blanket tighter around her scrubs. "Because I'm not staying here." Leo stopped. He rested one hand on the edge of the granite counter. His shoulders hitched, a microscopic flinch, and he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "You are staying. We covered this in the car." "You decreed it in the car," Cherie corrected, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. She walked toward him, the fear receding, replaced by the familiar cold pragmatism she used to navigate 12-hour trauma shifts. "I didn't agree to it. I'm not a piece of property you can stash in a high-rise vault till the streets are clean." Leo turned to face her. The harsh overhead, recessed lighting caught the sharp angles of his face. He looked pale, paler than he had in the SUV. He didn't argue with her. He just unbuttoned his suit jacket. He pulled it off, wincing as his left arm extended, and tossed the expensive wool over a leather bar stool. His crisp white dress shirt was soaked. A dark, blooming stain of fresh blood saturated the fabric over his left ribs, spreading steadily toward his waistband. Cherie stopped walking. The anger evaporated, instantly overridden by occupational instinct. "You tore the stitches," she said flatly. "I had a busy afternoon," Leo replied, his voice strained. He gripped the edge of the counter tighter, his knuckles turning white. "There was a disagreement regarding shipping routes at the port. It required a physical presence. You're an idiot. Cherie dropped her canvas tote on the floor. Where is your first aid kit? Tell me it's better than the rubbing alcohol and sewing thread you forced me to use 3 days ago. Master bathroom, down the hall. Second door on the right. Cherie didn't hesitate. She walked past him, navigating the stark, shadowy hallway. The bathroom was the size of her entire apartment, outfitted in floor-to-ceiling grey marble. She found the medical kit under the floating sink. It wasn't a standard drugstore box. It was a fully stocked trauma bag. Someone in Leo's line of work planned for bullets, not paper cuts. She grabbed the bag, 2 clean towels, and marched back to the kitchen. Leo was sitting on one of the bar stools now, his head tipped back, breathing through his nose in slow, measured counts. He had managed to unbutton his ruined shirt, letting it hang open. "Take it off," Cherie ordered, pulling a pair of black nitrile gloves from the trauma bag and snapping them onto her hands. Leo opened his eyes, studying her face. He didn't see panic anymore. He saw the cold, detached focus of a woman in her element. He stripped the shirt off and let it drop to the floor. The makeshift bandages Cherie had applied days ago were soaked through, the tape peeling away from his skin. She carefully peeled the gauze back. 3 of the heavy silk stitches had snapped completely. The wound was raw, angry, and oozing steadily. "You didn't go to a doctor," she stated, reaching into the bag for the betadine. "I could risk a paper trail. Not with the Lucases paying off half the precinct. So you just taped yourself up and went to a shootout." Cherie saturated a sterile pad with the brown antiseptic liquid. "Brace yourself, this is going to sting." She pressed the pad into the open cut. Leo's breath hissed through his teeth, his jaw locking so tight the muscles ticked beneath his skin. But he didn't pull away. He remained perfectly still, surrendering completely to her hands. It was a bizarre dynamic. He was the most dangerous man in the city, capable of ordering executions with a single phone call. Yet, sitting on a stool in his kitchen, he was entirely at her mercy. "Brody gave them my name," Cherie said softly, working with quick, practiced efficiency. She loaded a curved surgical needle with proper medical-grade nylon thread. "What happens to him?" "Brody is a symptom," Leo said, his voice a low, raspy rumble. He watched her hands move, his dark eyes tracking every stitch. "He's a degenerate gambler who owed the Lucasi family $200,000. They offered to clear his debt if he found the man bleeding in the alley. So he looked." "You didn't answer my question." Cherie tied off the first knot and pulled it to. "Brody will no longer be a problem for you." Leo said it was a terrifyingly neutral statement. "Finn is finalizing the paperwork to have Brody's debts transferred to my ledger. By tomorrow morning, the detective will realize he owes his life, his badge, and his kneecaps to me. He'll never look in your direction again." Cherie swallowed hard. She tied off the second stitch. And Vic Leo's expression shifted. The neutrality vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow darkness that made the hair on Cherie's arms stand up. It was the same look he had given her from the floor of her kitchen when his hand was around her throat. "Vic touched you," Leo said quietly. "He grabbed my arm. He put his hands on what belongs to me." "I don't belong to you," Cherie snapped, tying the final knot with aggressive force. She clipped the ends of the thread and taped a thick, sterile dressing over the closed wound. "I patched you up. I saved your life. That makes us even. It doesn't make me your property." Leo looked down at the fresh, neat bandage. Then he looked up, meeting her gaze. He didn't move away. He leaned in slightly, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You don't survive my world by being even, Cherie," he said softly, his voice vibrating in the quiet room. "You survive by holding the high ground. The Luces know you exist. They know you dragged me out of the snow. If I let you walk out that door tonight, they will use you to get to me. They will break you just to see if I bleed." Cherie stripped off the bloody gloves, her hands shaking slightly. She hated that he was right. She hated the cold, undeniable logic of his violence. "So I stay in the glass box," she whispered, looking out at the city lights. "You stay where I can see you," Leo corrected, "till I burn their house down." 3 days passed in a blur of grey skies and deafening silence. Cherie didn't go to work. Finn brought her a burner phone and a duffel bag containing her clothes, her toothbrush, and the worn paperback novel she had left on her nightstand. He also brought the flour canister. When Cherie opened it, $10,000 was exactly where she had left it. Leo was a ghost. He left the penthouse before the sun rose and returned long after she had fallen asleep in the sprawling guest bedroom. When she did see him, he was on the phone. His voice a low, urgent murmur, speaking in rapid, localized Italian, directing a war she couldn't see. She watched the local news. The anchors reported a sudden, violent spike in gang-related activity. A warehouse fire on the south side, a shooting outside a popular high-end steakhouse, an explosion at a shipping yard. The media called it a turf war. Cherie knew it was a demolition. On the 4th night, the storm broke. Cherie was sitting in the dark living room, watching the sleet hammer against the reinforced glass. The city below was a smeared, glowing grid. The elevator chimed. Cherie stood up as the doors opened. Leo stepped into the penthouse. He didn't look like a man who had won a war. He looked like a man who had barely survived it. His dark overcoat was soaked through with freezing rain. He had a split lip, a dark bruise swelling along his cheekbone, and his knuckles were split and bleeding. The air around him smelled of ozone, wet asphalt, and the sharp metallic tang of cordite. He stopped in the center of the room, looking at her, standing by the window. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind howling against the glass. "It's done," Leo said. His voice was grawly, exhausted. Cherie crossed her arms over her chest, keeping her distance. "All of it. The Lucchese family no longer has a foothold in Chicago," Lasso stated. He pulled off his heavy coat and dropped it on a chair. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, and drank it straight. "Their leadership is gone. Their territory is absorbed. The street is quiet." "And Vic?" Cherie asked, her voice tight. Leo set the glass down with a soft clink. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Vic is at the bottom of the river. He won't be grabbing anyone in a supply closet ever again." Cherie's stomach twisted. It wasn't revulsion, exactly. It was a heavy, cold acceptance. This was the reality of the man standing in front of her. He didn't call the police. He didn't file reports. He removed the threat permanently. "Finn is downstairs," Leo continued, turning to fully face her. "He has an envelope for you. It contains a new passport, a new social security number, and the deed to a property in upstate New York. It's quiet there. Safe. You can leave tonight. You will never have to look over your shoulder again." Cherie stared at him. She thought about the tiny apartment on the south side, the broken lock on the front door, the hissing radiator, the endless exhausting double shifts at St. Jude's, patching up the collateral damage of a city that didn't care about its people. She looked at the man who had ordered executions to keep her breathing. "And if I stay?" she asked. Leo went completely still. The silence in the room thickened, becoming heavy and suffocating. "If you stay," Leo said slowly, stepping away from the bar and walking toward her. "You don't get to pretend you don't know what I am. You don't get to look away from the blood." He stopped just a foot away from her. The smell of the freezing rain and gunpowder was intoxicating. "I didn't look away when you were bleeding in my garbage," Sherry said, her voice steady, refusing to break eye contact. "I stitched you up. That was dying stranger," Leo murmured, lifting his hand. He hesitated for a second before his bruised, raw knuckles gently brushed against her jawline. The touch was impossibly light for a man capable of such violence. "This is different, Sherry. I am not a good man. I am a monster who owns the dark. If you stay, you stand in that dark with me." Sherry closed her eyes for a brief second, leaning into the warmth of his palm. She wasn't a naive girl looking for a fairy tale. She was a cynical, exhausted woman who had finally found something solid enough to hold on to in a freezing, fractured world. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. "The dark doesn't scare me, Leo. I work the night shift." A slow, rough exhalation escaped Leo's lips, a sound of profound, anchoring relief. His hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He just pulled her forward, resting his forehead against hers, breathing her in like oxygen. The shivering stranger was dead. The Mafia boss remained, and Sherry, surrounded by the cold glass and the glittering city, finally felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Did Sherry make the biggest mistake of her life? Or is this the start of a dark empire? Drop a like if you're hooked, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in her shoes. Step over him or drag him inside. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 4, where the cops and the Mafia come knocking at Cher's door. The streets are cold, but this story is just heating up.